My name is Quartus Fimblithwaite, and I have been filing incident reports for the Galactic Academy on Kepler 9 station for approximately 347 standard cycles. In all my time wielding 6 different styluses simultaneously, managing 17 different forms of bureaucratic documentation, and maintaining what I consider to be exemplary records of interdisciplinary educational incidents, I have never, and I mean never, encountered a situation quite like the one I am about to document. But let me start from the beginning, because proper chronological order is essential for any decent incident report, and this particular incident is going to require a lot of proper documentation. The Galactic Academy, for those unfamiliar with our prestigious institution, sits proudly in the rotating section of Kepler 9 station, boasting students from over 237 different species across the known galaxy. We pride ourselves on diversity, inclusion, and what our marketing department calls harmonious interspecies learning experiences. The brochures are quite lovely, actually. Glossy finish, multiple holographic languages, and absolutely no mention whatsoever of the systematic reign of terror that had been plaguing our corridors for the past 4 academic cycles. That reign of terror had a name, and it stood exactly 12 feet, 3 inches tall in standard gravitational measurements. Zeth. Now the Drachnari species, bless their genetically enhanced hearts, are what polite interspecies relations manuals describe as naturally imposing. What those same manuals do not mention is that some Drachnari teenagers grow up to be absolute nightmares with razor-sharp teeth, retractable claws that could open a transport hull, and the charming personality of a black hole having a particularly bad day. Zeth had claimed the central corridor intersection as his personal territory sometime during his 2nd year. Every morning at precisely 0847 station time, he would position his massive frame right where the main academic wings converged, effectively creating what I had begun calling in my private notes, the gauntlet of educational doom. The smaller species students had developed elaborate route planning strategies to avoid this intersection. The pipsqueaks from Rigel 7 had started using the ventilation shafts. The crystal-based Silurians simply refused to attend morning classes altogether, and the poor Fluffington delegates from the Andromeda sector had petitioned 3 separate times to transfer to literally any other educational facility in the galaxy. But did our illustrious administration address this problem? Of course not. That would require decisive action, and decisive action generates paperwork, and excessive paperwork makes Administrator Moran break out in nervous welts. Instead, our brilliant leadership had decided to implement something called the Diversity Enhancement Initiative. The goal, according to the 43-page memorandum I had been required to file in triplicate, was to expand our student body to include previously underrepresented species and foster greater understanding through direct cultural exchange. Translation: they were bringing in students from species so obscure that nobody had bothered to document their behavioral patterns yet. Which brings me to the human. Now, humans had been classified as a minor spacefaring species for approximately 50 standard cycles. They had recently achieved faster-than-light travel, had begun establishing small colonies, and had submitted approximately 17,000 different applications to join various galactic educational programs. Most of these applications had been politely declined due to their species being classified as insufficient technological development and probable psychological instability. But apparently, some bureaucrat in the Galactic Education Council had decided that accepting one human student would look fantastic on their diversity statistics. Never mind that nobody had ever actually met a human before. Never mind that their homeworld was classified as a death world by our planetary habitability standards. Never mind that their species had something called military history that made most civilized species deeply uncomfortable. No, someone had rubber-stamped the application, and now we were getting our very first human exchange student. I had spent the previous week reviewing the sparse documentation available about human behavioral patterns. Apparently they were a pack-bonding species with tool-using capabilities and adaptive problem-solving methodologies. The reports also mentioned something about emotional support animals, but the translator had been unclear about what exactly that meant. All I knew for certain was that our human student was scheduled to arrive at 1300 hours today, and I had the sinking feeling that my perfectly organized filing system was about to become significantly more complicated. Zeth, meanwhile, had been positively gleeful about the news. A new species meant a new victim, and from what he had gathered about human physical specifications, they were significantly smaller than his usual targets. He had been bragging to his Draknari friends about how he was going to establish proper hierarchy with the newcomer. I made a note to prepare extra incident report forms, because somehow I had the distinct impression that we were all about to discover exactly why humans had classified their homeworld as suitable for habitation, despite conditions that would kill most civilized species within minutes. And I was absolutely, completely, utterly correct about that assessment. At exactly 1300 hours, the transport bay doors hissed open with their usual dramatic flair, and outstepped what I can only describe as the most underwhelming specimen I had ever witnessed in my 3.5 centuries of educational administration. Brandon Torres, age 16 according to his documentation, stood approximately 5 feet and 9 inches tall in standard measurements. His skin was a light brown color that reminded me of the filing cabinets in Storage Bay 7, and his hair was dark and appeared to require some form of chemical maintenance product. He wore what I assumed were standard human garments, dark blue leg coverings, some sort of white torso covering, and footwear that made small squeaking sounds against the station flooring. But none of that was particularly noteworthy. What was noteworthy was the small rectangular container he carried in his left hand. The container appeared to be made of some sort of metallic mesh material, had several air holes punctured in strategic locations, and was making occasional rustling sounds that suggested something alive was inside. Administrator Marine, bless his perpetually nervous disposition, practically materialized beside the human with a stack of documentation thick enough to serve as emergency hull plating. Mr. Torres, Maureen announced, his voice cracking slightly on the surname. Welcome to Galactic Academy. I trust your journey was adequate. The human looked at Moran with an expression I would later learn to recognize as barely contained amusement mixed with mild irritation. It was a very specific look, and humans apparently had an entire repertoire of such expressions. Oh, fantastic, Brandon replied, his voice carrying what I now recognize as classic human sarcasm. 18 hours in a cramped transport ship, with recycled air that smelled like a garbage disposal, sitting next to a Ventaxian who spent the entire trip discussing the mating habits of space slugs. Absolutely magical. Moran blinked rapidly, clearly unsure whether this constituted a complaint or a compliment. Yes, well, about your accommodation request. He shuffled through his papers with increasing desperation. I have here 17 different forms regarding something called an emotional support animal, but I must confess, our translation protocols are having difficulty with several key terms. Brandon glanced down at his carrier, and I swear I saw the corner of his mouth twitch upward. Yeah, Killer gets pretty restless during long trips. He's been cooped up for almost 20 hours now. Killer? Moran's voice went up approximately 2 octaves. That's his name, Brandon said, with the sort of casual tone one might use when discussing lunch selections. Don't worry. He's perfectly harmless as long as nobody tries to mess with me. At this point, a small crowd of students had begun to gather. The pipsqueaks were chittering excitedly about the tiny new species, while the Silurians were making their crystalline humming sounds that indicated either curiosity or digestive issues. And then, of course, Zeth Morvac decided to make his entrance. The massive Draknari shouldered his way through the crowd with all the subtlety of a meteor impact. His claws extended with that particular metallic scraping sound that had become the soundtrack of terror for smaller students throughout the academy. He loomed over Brandon with what he probably considered an intimidating smile, revealing teeth that could have doubled as industrial cutting tools. Well, Zeth rumbled, his voice carrying the sort of bass frequencies that made the station's hull vibrate slightly. Look what the transport dragged in. Another little snack for the food chain. Brandon looked up at the towering predator with an expression of such profound boredom that I actually checked my chronometer to make sure time hadn't stopped. Oh, great, he said in the flattest tone I had ever heard. The welcoming committee has arrived. Let me guess, you're the local tough guy who gets his kicks intimidating smaller species because your own species probably used you as a chew toy growing up. The corridor went absolutely silent. Even the station's background humming seemed to pause in anticipation. Zeth's eyes narrowed to predatory slits. What did you just say to me, little meat? Brandon shifted the carrier to his other hand with deliberate casualness. I said you're probably compensating for some deep-seated childhood trauma by bullying beings half your size. It's a pretty common psychological defense mechanism among apex predators who feel insecure about their place in the social hierarchy. I quickly grabbed 3 additional styluses. This was going to require extensive documentation. The carrier in Brandon's hand gave a small rattle, and for just a moment I could have sworn I heard something that sounded like a low, rumbling growl. But surely that was just the station's ventilation system. Surely. The Academy cafeteria at lunch period was typically a symphony of controlled chaos. 237 different species, each with their own dietary requirements, social hierarchies, and table manners, somehow managed to coexist in what Administrator Moran optimistically called harmonious multicultural dining. What actually happened was more like a carefully choreographed dance of terror, with everyone desperately trying to avoid Zeth Morvac's usual table in the center of the room. Brandon Torres had apparently missed the memo about established seating arrangements. I watched through the observation window as the human walked directly to the food dispensers, selected what appeared to be a standard protein synthesis meal, and then proceeded to sit at a table exactly 3 meters from Zeth's territorial zone. He placed his carrier on the chair beside him and began eating with the sort of casual indifference that suggested he was either incredibly brave or completely oblivious to the social dynamics around him. The other students reacted like prey animals, sensing an approaching predator. The pipsqueaks immediately abandoned their half-finished meals and scurried toward the exits. The Fluffington delegates started making distressed chirping sounds and huddled together near the emergency evacuation protocols poster. Even the usually confident Ventaxians began edging toward the far corners of the room. Zeth, meanwhile, was clearly enjoying the mounting tension. He finished his meal with deliberate slowness, licking his claws clean with theatrical precision, before rising to his full intimidating height and approaching Brandon's table. "New student," Zeth announced, his voice carrying across the now silent cafeteria. "I don't think we've been properly introduced." Brandon looked up from his meal without any apparent concern. "Brandon Torres, and you must be the local ecosystem's apex predator wannabe." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Zeth's response was his traditional dominance display, a performance he had perfected over years of systematic intimidation. He threw back his massive head and released a roar that rattled the meal dispensers and caused several smaller species to whimper audibly. His claws extended to their full 8-inch length, scoring deep grooves in the table surface. His crest fins flared out like a biological warning system, and his pupils dilated to those terrifying black voids that had haunted the nightmares of countless students. Brandon took another bite of his protein synthesis and waited for the performance to end. "Wow," he said finally, his voice carrying that same flat disinterest. "That was really something. Do you practice that in front of a mirror, or does it just come naturally when you're dealing with interstellar compensation issues?" Zeth's roar cut off abruptly. "Compensation issues? You know, the whole I'm going to make myself seem bigger and scarier because I'm secretly insecure about my actual capabilities thing. It's pretty textbook predator psychology. My species has extensive documentation on it." The carrier beside Brandon began making soft scratching sounds, as if something inside was becoming restless. "Listen, kid," Zeth snarled, leaning down until his massive head was level with Brandon's. "I don't know what kind of soft, peaceful little world you crawled out of, but here's how things work in the real galaxy. Big, strong predators eat small, weak prey. It's the natural order." Brandon glanced at his carrier, then back at Zeth with what I was beginning to recognize as a very dangerous smile. "Actually, you might want to be careful about making assumptions regarding what's natural order when it comes to my species." The scratching sounds from the carrier intensified, accompanied by what sounded suspiciously like low, rumbling vocalizations. "Oh, and Zeth," Brandon added conversationally, "you might want to step back a bit. Killer doesn't like it when people get too close to me while he's hungry." Zeth glanced dismissively at the small container. "Killer? You named your little pet Killer? What is it, some kind of decorative fish? A fuzzy little comfort creature?" The rumbling from the carrier grew noticeably louder. "Something like that," Brandon agreed, still maintaining that unsettling calm. "He's about 30 pounds of pure attitude and absolutely zero sense of self-preservation. Sweet little guy, really. Loves belly rubs, and has never met a fight he wouldn't pick." Zeth laughed, a sound like grinding metal. 30 pounds? I weigh over 400 pounds, little human. Your Killer is barely a snack." Brandon looked thoughtful. "You know, that's exactly what the last guy said." "What last guy?" The carrier gave a particularly vigorous rattle, and Brandon's smile widened slightly. "The guy before he learned why we call him Killer." Brandon reached for the carrier with the sort of deliberate theatrical slowness that suggested he was thoroughly enjoying the moment. His fingers worked the latching mechanism with practiced ease, and I found myself leaning forward in my observation post, 6 styluses, poised and ready for what I suspected was going to be the most comprehensive incident report of my career. "You know what, Zeth?" Brandon said conversationally as he lifted the carrier's front panel. "I think it's time you met my emotional support animal." The cafeteria held its collective breath as the carrier door swung open. What emerged was not what anyone had expected. Killer was approximately 30 pounds of compact muscular fury wrapped in a deceptively attractive black and white fur pattern. He had a distinctive white stripe running from his nose to the back of his head, small rounded ears and bright intelligent eyes that immediately began scanning the cafeteria like a tactical assessment unit evaluating potential threats. The collective reaction from the alien students was immediate and unanimous: confused disappointment. "That's it?" squeaked one of the pipsqueaks from near the exit. "It's so small and fuzzy," added a Fluffington delegate, sounding almost insulted. "It looks like a decorative pet creature." "Seriously?" rumbled a Ventaxian. "That's what we were all worried about. It's adorable." Zeth looked down at Killer with the sort of expression typically reserved for discovering that your supposedly terrifying enemy had brought a plastic spoon to a plasma rifle fight. "This is your big scary Killer? It looks like something you'd give to a youngling as a cuddle toy." Brandon settled back in his chair with obvious satisfaction. "Oh, Killer's definitely a cuddle enthusiast. He also holds the galactic record for most willing to fight creatures significantly larger than himself. Fun fact, honey badgers from Earth are classified as the most fearless animals on our planet." "Honey badger?" Zeth snorted. "What kind of ridiculous name is that?" "Well, they're called honey badgers because they raid bee colonies for honey, despite getting stung hundreds of times in the process. The pain doesn't bother them, neither does the venom. They just keep going until they get what they want." Killer had finished his initial reconnaissance and was now staring directly at Zeth, with the sort of focused intensity that made me deeply uncomfortable. His small body had gone perfectly still in the way that predators do just before they strike. "But here's the really interesting part," Brandon continued in the tone of someone delivering a particularly entertaining lecture. "Honey badgers don't just fight animals their own size. They regularly take on lions, leopards, hyenas, and even African rock pythons. They've been documented attacking water buffalo, rhinos, and once, memorably, an entire pack of wild dogs." Zeth's confident smirk was beginning to waver slightly. "That's impossible. Something that small could—" "Oh, but wait, there's more," Brandon interrupted cheerfully. "They have incredibly thick, loose skin that makes them nearly impossible to grab effectively. Their claws can dig through concrete. They have no natural fear response whatsoever, and when they decide something is a threat, they have exactly one strategy: complete and total annihilation of the target." Killer's head tilted slightly as he continued his assessment of Zeth, and I swear I could see the exact moment when the honey badger reached his tactical conclusion. Zeth was definitely a threat, and threats needed to be eliminated. Plus, Brandon added, they're immune to most venoms, have been known to shrug off cobra bites, and once survived being buried alive for 2 hours before digging themselves out and continuing their rampage. They're basically 30 pounds of weaponized determination, wrapped in a cute, fuzzy package. "You're making that up?" Zeth declared. But his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Am I?" Brandon asked mildly. That was when Killer made his move. The honey badger launched himself from the chair with the sort of explosive acceleration that would have impressed military weapons designers throughout the galaxy. He hit the floor running and charged directly at Zeth's massive legs with absolutely zero hesitation, zero fear, and what appeared to be considerable enthusiasm for the upcoming violence. Zeth's reaction was immediate and instinctive. He jumped backward with a startled yelp that was thoroughly undignified for a creature of his size and reputation. "What the? It's actually attacking me?" he roared in disbelief. The cafeteria erupted into chaos. Students began screaming and running for the exits as if someone had announced an imminent hull breach. Tables overturned as various species fled in terror, not from the 12-foot apex predator, but from the 30-pound earth mammal who was chasing said predator around the room with single-minded determination. "Oh yeah," Brandon called out over the pandemonium, still seated calmly at his table. "I probably should have mentioned that Killer doesn't really understand the concept of backing down, or retreat, or impossible odds. He's got this weird character flaw where he interprets everything larger than himself as a personal challenge." Zeth attempted to swat at his tiny attacker, but Killer was already demonstrating why honey badgers were considered nearly impossible to catch. He ducked, weaved, and came back at the Draknari's ankles with relentless precision. "This is insane," Zeth bellowed as he continued his strategic retreat. "Make it stop." Brandon shrugged. "Killer doesn't really take orders from anyone. He's more of an independent contractor. But hey, look on the bright side. You're about to become the first student in Academy history to lose a fight to something that weighs less than your breakfast. And that, my fellow administrators, was when I realized that our minor spacefaring species classification for humans might have been just a tiny bit inaccurate." What followed was, without question, the most spectacular display of interspecies combat that the Galactic Academy had ever witnessed. And trust me, we had hosted Regillian honor duels, Centaurian wrestling championships, and that memorable incident involving two gastropod philosophers arguing about the nature of existence. None of those compared to watching a 12-foot apex predator getting systematically dismantled by 30 pounds of earth mammal with anger management issues. Killer's strategy was simple, effective, and absolutely terrifying in its execution. He had identified Zeth's weak points with the precision of a military tactician and was now implementing what could only be described as targeted psychological warfare through persistent ankle harassment. "Oh, this is beautiful," Brandon announced from his ringside seat, apparently deciding to provide live commentary for the educational benefit of anyone still brave enough to watch. "See how he's going for the tendons behind the knee joint. Classic honey badger technique. They instinctively know that mobility kills are the most effective way to bring down larger prey." Zeth was hopping around the cafeteria like a demented 12-foot ballet dancer, desperately trying to shake off his tiny tormentor. Every time he lifted one leg to escape Killer's claws, the honey badger would simply switch to attacking the other ankle with even greater enthusiasm. "Get it off, get it off," Zeth bellowed, his voice reaching frequencies I had never heard from a Draknari throat. "Fun fact," Brandon continued in his best nature documentary voice, "honey badgers have been observed taking down animals over 10 times their size through pure persistence and strategic targeting of weak points. They're like tiny, furry tactical missiles with absolutely no sense of self-preservation." The remaining students who hadn't fled were now pressed against the walls, watching in stunned amazement as their school's most feared predator performed what could generously be called the dance of desperate evasion. The pipsqueaks were chittering excitedly, apparently finding the role reversal deeply satisfying. Several Fluffington delegates had started what sounded like celebratory chirping. Killer, meanwhile, was demonstrating why honey badgers were considered nature's most relentless warriors. Every time Zeth managed to create some distance, the honey badger would simply charge again with even greater determination. His claws were leaving impressive gouges in Zeth's supposedly impenetrable scales, and his teeth were finding purchase on sensitive areas that armor plating apparently didn't protect. "This is impossible," Zeth roared, attempting to grab Killer with his massive claws. Nothing this small should be able to. But Killer's loose skin made him nearly impossible to grasp effectively. Every time Zeth thought he had a grip, the honey badger would twist, slip free, and immediately resume his ankle-focused assault with what appeared to be increased irritation at being temporarily restrained. "Oh, that was a mistake," Brandon observed cheerfully. "Killer really doesn't like being grabbed. That's probably going to make him even more motivated." Sure enough, Killer's attacks intensified. He was now making small, growling sounds that somehow managed to be more intimidating than Zeth's earlier roaring display. The honey badger had entered what Brandon would later explain was full tactical mode, where the animal's already limited sense of self-preservation completely disappeared in favor of total commitment to neutralizing the perceived threat. "Make it stop," Zeth pleaded, now reduced to jumping onto tables in a futile attempt to escape ground-level assault. Killer responded by demonstrating Honey Badger's impressive climbing abilities, scaling the table leg with the efficiency of a professional assault specialist. "Surrender," Zeth finally screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "I surrender. Call it off. Please." Brandon looked thoughtful. "Killer, that's enough. He's learned his lesson." The honey badger paused in his relentless assault, looked back at Brandon, then at Zeth, and apparently decided that the 12-foot predator had indeed been sufficiently educated about the dangers of threatening his human. He backed away slowly, maintaining eye contact with Zeth in a clear warning that any future aggressive behavior would result in renewed educational sessions. Zeth collapsed onto the table, breathing heavily and staring at his tiny conqueror with the sort of expression typically reserved for encountering cosmic phenomena that defied all known laws of physics. What is that thing?" he gasped. "That," Brandon said with obvious pride, "is 30 pounds of Earth evolution's most successful I don't care how big you are attitude, wrapped in a cute package that makes people underestimate him until it's too late." The cafeteria had gone completely silent, except for Zeth's labored breathing and Killer's satisfied huffing. Students who had been terrorized by the Draknari for years were now looking at him with something approaching pity. The hierarchy had officially shifted. From that moment forward, Zeth Morvac would be known throughout the academy as the guy who got schooled by a fuzzy earth animal, and Brandon Torres would be recognized as the student you definitely didn't want to mess with. Killer, meanwhile, had apparently decided that his work was done. He trotted back to Brandon's table, hopped onto his chair, and began grooming himself with the casual satisfaction of someone who had just completed a particularly successful day at the office. "Good boy," Brandon said, scratching behind Killer's ears. "Now who wants to hear about the time he fought a cobra?" The entire cafeteria took a collective step backward. The transformation of Galactic Academy's social ecosystem following what I had officially documented as the Great Cafeteria Incident was both fascinating and deeply concerning from an administrative perspective. Within 48 hours, our entire student hierarchy had been completely reorganized around a single terrifying principle: avoid annoying the small Earth creature at all costs. Killer had appointed himself as the Academy's unofficial justice dispensary system, and he took his new responsibilities very seriously indeed. His daily routine had become as predictable as the station's rotation schedule. Every morning at 07:30, he would begin what I had started calling his patrol rounds. The honey badger would trot through the corridors with the confident stride of someone who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved through strategic application of clause and attitude, methodically checking each major congregation area for signs of what he apparently considered unacceptable behavior. The first to learn about Killer's expanded law enforcement mandate were the Draknari upperclassmen, who had been systematically extorting lunch credits from younger students. They discovered that honey badgers have excellent memories for faces and absolutely zero tolerance for what humans apparently call picking on someone your own size. "It was horrible," sobbed Krex Bloodtooth, a 7-foot Draknari, who had been found cowering in a storage closet after Killer had educated him about proper hallway etiquette. "I was just collecting my usual tribute from some pipsqueaks, and suddenly there was this furry nightmare latched onto my ankle, making these terrifying growling sounds. It wouldn't let go until I gave all the credits back and apologized. The Regillian fight clubs that had been operating in the lower maintenance levels lasted exactly 1 day after Killer discovered them. Apparently, honey badgers consider unauthorized combat to be a personal insult to their professional expertise in violence management. Brandon, meanwhile, had been elevated from insignificant new student to person whose opinion carries the weight of potential ankle destruction, faster than anyone could have anticipated. Students began approaching him with their problems, apparently operating under the assumption that if you were allied with the Academy's most effective enforcer, you might be able to influence his deployment decisions. I never asked to be the student mediator, Brandon complained to me during one of our increasingly frequent documentation sessions. But apparently, when your emotional support animal has a reputation for righteous fury, people assume you're some kind of cosmic justice dispenser. The academic staff was having their own adjustment difficulties. Professor Quillen from Advanced Astrophysics had submitted a formal request for honey badger-proof classroom protocols after Killer had disrupted his lecture to investigate why several students were sleeping during what the honey badger apparently considered important learning time. The creature stared at me for a full minute, Professor Quillen reported, his normally steady voice trembling slightly. Then it made this chittering sound and looked directly at the sleeping students. They all woke up immediately and paid attention for the rest of the class. It was the most attentive lecture I've ever given, but I'm concerned about the psychological implications of education through intimidation. Various species had begun conducting their own research into Earth mammals, with predictably alarming results. The Centaurian biology students had compiled a comprehensive database of what they called Earth's Biological Warfare Division, which included terrifying creatures called wolverines, Tasmanian devils, and something called a Canadian goose, that apparently attacked without provocation and felt no remorse. "We've been studying human companion animals," announced Dr. Fimblethorne during one of our faculty meetings, "and we've discovered that humans have domesticated predators that other species use as military weapons. They keep creatures called dogs that are descended from pack hunters, cats that are apparently serial killers with excellent PR departments, and something called ferrets that are described as tubes of pure chaos with theft problems." Administrator Moran's condition had deteriorated significantly. His nervous welts had developed into full-scale stress patterns, and he had started wearing what he called protective documentation armor, essentially carrying multiple data pads and incident report forms at all times in case of emergency bureaucratic requirements. "I've filed 47 incident reports in 3 days, he informed me, during one of his increasingly frequent panic consultations. 47. Do you know what our previous weekly average was? 2. And those were usually just minor dietary incompatibility issues or translation errors." The academic board had convened emergency sessions to discuss what they euphemistically called containment protocols. These meetings typically lasted several hours and accomplished absolutely nothing, except generating more paperwork for me to file. "We need policies," declared Board Chairman Vexterin, during our third emergency session. "Specific guidelines about acceptable emotional support animals. Size limitations, aggression assessments, psychological evaluations." "For the animals or the students?" asked board member Trillix. "Yes," replied Vexterin without hesitation. They had also begun developing contingency plans for what they called additional human students. Apparently someone had discovered that Brandon's application was part of a pilot program, and there were potentially dozens more humans scheduled to arrive over the next academic year. "What if they all have emotional support animals?" Trillix had asked during our most recent crisis meeting. "What if they bring creatures even more terrifying than honey badgers?" This question had generated 17 different emergency protocol proposals, 43 additional forms for my filing system, and what I suspect was Administrator Moran's first genuine nervous breakdown. Meanwhile, Killer continued his patrols with the satisfaction of someone who had finally found his true calling. The Academy's bullying incidents had dropped to 0, class attendance was at an all-time high, and students were treating each other with unprecedented politeness. Order had been restored to Galactic Academy. It just happened to be enforced by 30 pounds of Earth evolution's most successful anger management system, and nobody was entirely sure how to feel about that development. The revelation came exactly 2 weeks after what the students had started calling Honey Badger Day, delivered in the form of Admiral Vashi stepping off a military transport with the sort of purposeful stride that suggested our little educational experiment had attracted attention from significantly higher up the Galactic Command structure than anyone had anticipated. Admiral Vashi was a Centaurian, which meant she stood 8 feet tall, had 4 arms, and possessed the kind of tactical intelligence that had made her species the galaxy's premier military strategists. She also carried herself with the confident bearing of someone who had seen enough combat to know exactly how dangerous the universe could be. What she had not expected to see was a 12-foot Draknari doing homework assignments while a small black and white Earth mammal supervised from a nearby chair. "Administrator Murren," Admiral Vashi said after observing this scene for several long moments, "I believe we need to discuss the current status of your human exchange student." Moran, who had developed a nervous twitch in his left eye since Brandon's arrival, immediately began rifling through his documentation armor. "Yes, Admiral. I have all the relevant reports right here. 47 incident reports, 12 emergency protocol revisions, and 6 requests for psychological evaluation services." "I'm less interested in your paperwork," Admiral Vashi replied dryly, "and more interested in understanding how a single human teenager has managed to completely reorganize your academy's social structure in under 3 weeks. That was when Brandon wandered into the administrative office, Killer trotting beside him with the casual confidence of someone who owned the place. "Oh hey," Brandon said, noticing the Admiral's imposing presence. "You must be here about the evaluation thing. My guidance counselor back on Earth mentioned something about that." Admiral Vashi studied Brandon with the sort of analytical attention typically reserved for assessing enemy weapons systems. "You were aware that your placement here was part of an assessment program?" Brandon shrugged. "Yeah, they told me I was basically a test case to see if humans could handle galactic education standards. Seemed like a pretty straightforward cultural exchange thing." "And your emotional support animal was part of this assessment?" Killer looked up at the Admiral with mild interest, apparently deciding that she wasn't an immediate threat, but bore watching just in case. "Killer goes everywhere with me," Brandon explained. "Anxiety management, you know. Having him around helps me stay calm in stressful situations." Admiral Vashi glanced around the office, noting the stress patterns on Administrator Moran's forehead, the emergency protocol manuals stacked 3 feet high, and the general atmosphere of barely controlled panic that had become the Academy's new normal. "I see," she said carefully, "and has he been effective in managing your anxiety?" "Oh, absolutely," Brandon replied cheerfully. "I haven't been stressed about anything since we got here. Killer's really good at handling problem situations before they can bother me." The Admiral requested a demonstration. What followed was a carefully controlled presentation in the Academy's main gymnasium, where Killer was introduced to a series of increasingly challenging potential threat scenarios. These included aggressive posturing from volunteer faculty members, simulated bullying situations, and what the Admiral described as standard intimidation protocols. Killer's responses were swift, decisive, and absolutely terrifying in their efficiency. "Remarkable," Admiral Vashi noted as Killer calmly returned to Brandon's side after convincing a 7-foot Regalian volunteer that aggressive behavior was inadvisable. "Most military units would consider this level of tactical response highly valuable." "Oh, this is nothing," Brandon said casually. "Wait until you meet my cousin's Wolverine, or my neighbor who has this rescue pit bull named Princess Cupcake. She's basically a tank with separation anxiety and a tendency to protect anyone she considers family." The color drained from Administrator Marian's face. "There are more of these creatures?" "Well, yeah," Brandon replied, as if this should have been obvious. "Earth has lots of animals that make good companions. There are German shepherds, which are basically wolves that decided to become police officers. Rottweilers, which are what happens when you breed loyalty with the stopping power of a small vehicle. And don't get me started on geese. Those things are basically feathered terrorism with anger management issues." Admiral Vashi was taking notes. By the end of the week, the Galactic Education Council had fast-tracked human integration into Academy programs across 17 different star systems. Apparently, a species that could domesticate apex predators as emotional support systems was considered to have significant potential for galactic citizenship. The honey badger had become something of a celebrity. Xenobiology students from across the sector were submitting applications to study Earth's Biological Diversity Initiative, and several military academies had requested consultations about alternative crowd control methodologies. Brandon, meanwhile, had settled into his new role as the Academy's unofficial problem-solving consultant, with the same casual acceptance he'd shown for everything else. When disputes arose, students would bring them to Brandon, who would listen to both sides while Killer assessed the situation for potential violence requirements. Most problems got resolved through simple negotiation. The ones that didn't got resolved when Killer expressed his opinion about fair treatment and proper behavior. On my final day documenting this extraordinary period in Academy history, I observed Brandon in the library, working on an advanced galactic history assignment while Zeth carefully organized his research materials and took detailed notes. "Is this arrangement satisfactory, Brandon?" Zeth asked politely. "I've color-coded the source materials according to chronological periods, and I can provide additional research assistance if needed." "That's great, Zeth," Brandon replied without looking up from his datapad. "Just make sure you include the bibliography citations. Professor Kerensky is really particular about documentation standards." Killer supervised from his position on the table, occasionally lifting his head to ensure that Zeth's homework assistants met appropriate quality standards. And that, fellow administrators, is how our minor spacefaring species ended up teaching the rest of the galaxy an important lesson about the strategic value of proper emotional support systems. I've submitted my final report recommending immediate expansion of the human exchange program. After all, if this is what they can accomplish with just one teenager and his pet, I'm genuinely curious to see what happens when they bring the really impressive animals. Though I suspect Administrator Moran might require extended medical leave before we find out.